Awesome, and we are live. So this is going to be a video. I got a couple of videos in the pipeline here coming up. A couple of book reviews, some other stuff that I hope you guys are going to find interesting. But before then, I had a comment. I had a subscriber who's commented on a couple of videos actually, and I like to answer questions if I think that they're coming from someone who doesn't agree with me, and also if they're asked in good faith, which this guy definitely does. He's commented a couple times, and somebody who's not a libertarian but found my channel because of the foreskin restoration, anti-circumcision stuff. So I always appreciate that kind of dialogue, and I also have a rule that if I feel like in a response that I'm going to type a lot, it's going to be a long response, I don't want to do that because very few people will see the answer. So I like to make a video so that more people can see it if it's something that I think is a valuable topic, which in this case I definitely do. So let me go ahead and read what he wrote. Let's see. So this is from a subscriber named Peter Perigu, and he's been commenting a lot recently. I don't know how long he's been watching, but I'm going to guess it's not too long if he's having a whole bunch of comments right now. So this is about, as the title implies, about gun control. Why is this an important topic for me or for conservatives? So putting the debate aside as to whether firearms should be legal to purchase and own or not. So first of all, that's not your question here, but the fact that this is something that you think whether they should be legal to purchase or not is, unless you're just asking this out of pure hypothetical interest, this really indicates an enormous gulf between what you entertain as something that's debatable and what I think is debatable, right? There is legally absolutely no question the firearms should be legal to own and purchase. It, in fact, the debate is if there can be any restrictions at all, and if so, what are they? That's the legal debate. I think that the evidence is quite strong that there should not be any, or that they should be extremely, extremely mitigated. But even independent of the legal question, the ethical and moral question, they definitely should be legal to own and purchase. This is not even a debate in my mind. And if it is in yours, I mean, it's possible that this is just, putting it out there is like a hypothetical. Fine, fair enough. We can hypothetically question anything, including owning guns, right? But practically speaking, if that is true, then I just want to stress that this is an enormous gulf that separates someone who has this opinion and me when it comes to this topic. Whatever else we may agree on other things is huge. But so that's just parenthetical. A question I've always wanted to ask a gun advocate and or gun owner would be this: why is firearm ownership so vehemently defended by conservatives / libertarians alongside what I would deem serious issues such as a woman's rights to choose and addressing climate change? So there's a couple of things in this that I'm not sure I agree with. I don't think gun rights advocates are going to just see that the issues are linked necessarily. So I don't think conservatives or libertarians, speaking for myself and even watching other conservatives, libertarians, I don't think that they say, okay, well, climate change, abortion, and, or as you like to call it, women's rights to choose, and gun rights, they're clustered, they're connected in some way. They're not. Maybe they all think they're important, but they probably think they're important for radically different reasons. And they may not think all of them are important, right? I think there's a lot of conservatives who would say climate change isn't necessarily that important. I think most of them come down on one side of the abortion debate, but I don't even know how many of them think it's important. It is certainly very, very important for some people. I know a lot of conservatives where abortion is the one topic, the most important issue, just because they do consider it mass murder. And so if you consider it mass murder, then it's the most important thing. Not everyone is that animated. So I don't think I agree with that they're necessarily clustered in any kind of coherent way, or that they need to be clustered in any coherent way. As he goes on, these are serious wedge issues that need to be hashed out by both political parties, but I personally do not see how the issue of firearm ownership is comparable to these earnest issues. Well, no one's saying, you're the one drawing the comparison. I'm not. I don't think that people draw them. But the other thing is, what makes you think that gun ownership is not an earnest issue? People are very earnest about gun ownership and gun rights. And so this is where I think I have an answer. I can start to answer your question. There's a couple different there's a couple different venues or areas where it is really important to people. So one is the just ethically speaking, there's a deontological argument for gun rights, right? Just completely independent of utilitarianism or consequentialism or crime rates or anything like that. There's just the idea that I should have a right to own property, and if I want to own a gun, I should be able to own a gun, and that's none of your business. And if you're going to, quote unquote, infringe on that right, burden of proof really falls on you, and it's actually a huge infringement to do that. And so there's that. There's the argument that it's in the Constitution very explicitly and very clearly, or at least most people would say very clearly. You have to really do a lot of gymnastics to say the Second Amendment says something other than it does. Not that you can't do that. You can play all kinds of word games, and the government's very good at playing word games with the law to open up loopholes big enough to do whatever it is that it wants to do, regardless of what the founders may have thought or wrote. But there's also going to be the people who are going to take a very legalistic view and say, well, that is the law. And this is kind of interesting because many people are the same people who are going to argue that the Constitution somehow allows for massive gun control, or maybe perhaps even to the level of banning ownership, which I'm not saying that you're suggesting that, but you're entertaining that as a debatable point. Those are the same people who would say the Constitution allows that, but then very likely those are the same people who would say the Constitution is completely outmoded and should just be abolished for something radically more permissive for government power. So it's kind of interesting that they would try and make a legalistic argument, but then say, well, we really don't even like the law as it exists. We want to radically change the law, which is, I mean, there's a high correlation there. It's not necessarily everyone. So to the extent that people venerate the Constitution, and I'm not one of those people, by the way. I think the Constitution is a really interesting document. I think they made they did their level best to, make a system that they thought would work, and they did an okay job, but I don't venerate it. I think there's huge problems with the Constitution. There always were. There are some things that could probably be improved, but I think we would actually need, if we really wanted to get to the root of a lot of the problems that we have, we would need a revolutionary abolition of the Constitution. It's just my overall take, whatever merit I want to put there, but I'm not your average libertarian conservative as far as that goes, and I think a lot of them are going to say, look, that's what the Constitution says. That's the basis on which the republic is founded, right? Like there's states, for instance, that have said things along the lines of, we joined the United States, we agreed to live by the Constitution. The Constitution is the Second Amendment. So if you're going to come and say that's not part of the deal, then that's basically, it's like saying the contract, the social contract, I mean, in this case, a literal constitution, is null and void, right? You're basically reneging on a promise there. And there's actually state legislatures like Wyoming, Montana, Tennessee, Idaho that have explicitly said that. So there's that. But then I think there's even more. So that's like the utilitarian, or not, that's the deontological rights-based approach, right? People just take their rights very seriously. They have good reasons to want to do that. But then there's a utilitarian thing. Okay, so the idea, guns have lots of useful things, right? People use them for hunting, people use them for recreation, people use them for investment, people use them as a hobby, as a competitive thing to do. There's people who target shoot for fun, who trap shoot for fun. There's people who just like to do competitions, right? That's all true. And then, of course, guns are used in self-defense against private criminals, all the time. Our numbers indicate probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times per year. The vast majority of those times, the gun's never fired. It's simply brandished, and the criminal decides that whatever they wanted to do is not worth it. Right? So these are all perfectly legitimate reasons to allow guns. But the main reason, and I'll put this in terms that I hope make sense, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and this seems to be what at least most of the founders were thinking about when they put it in there, because the language is there, and they talked about it more explicitly in their other writings, is that it's itself a check against tyrannical government, right? So just like a liberal might think that the Supreme Court is there as a check against a tyrannical government, or the legislature is there to prevent the president from being too powerful, or that's why we have impeachment. Imagine if, say, Donald Trump were to come out and say, I'm going to abolish impeachment, right? I'm going to change the law so that I can't be impeached. I think that most liberals would react with horror to that, and they'd be like, "What? That's obviously, if President Trump is making it so that he can't be impeached, if he's changing the law so that's just not a legal option, right? How he would have to pass a constitutional amendment to do that. But let's say that he made that effort. He said, I'm going to make it so that I can't get impeached. And he gives his reasons, right? He says there's a whole bunch of the QAnon conspiracy, or there's a bunch of liberals who hate me. And so they're going to impeach me, and I can't get it done in Congress, but I can get, 2/3 of the states to change this. So I think that you would react like, well, that's obviously horrifying. The fact that they're trying to take away a check against their power is itself highly indicative of, it's a warning sign, it's a red flag. And I think that many people will say that any kind of attempt to curtail and certainly to abolish, right? It's bad enough to say you need to have a background check, or certain types of guns are illegal, or there's limits, or things like that. Those are in and of themselves very, very bad, if not existential threats. But if you're going to talk about debating whether they can be bought legally and owned legally at all, then that's basically saying we want to have the ability to enact a tyranny. So they're going to react to that very negatively, just like you might react negatively if Trump tried to abolish impeachment, or, even more blatantly, get rid of the legislature or get rid of the justices. It's kind of similar. I mean, we've had sort of similar things with court packing schemes, right? When presidents in the past, FDR being the most famous example, FDR was probably the most powerful president that we've ever had when he was in office. He had gigantic, enormous majorities in the House and the Senate, and people were desperate, and he was a very shrewd politician, and yet the Supreme Court invalidated about half of the New Deal early on, and so he decided to increase the number of judges. The deal was that he would appoint one judge for every judge over 75 or something like that, which would have added, 6 or 7 justices, because they were mostly old men, and then he could use that as a way to just get the court to approve whatever he was doing, right? So the idea, this vaunted idea of checks and balances, which I think most people agree is probably a good idea, and I'll come to that in a second, because I think that is part of the crux of the disagreement here. That was such a blatant power grab that there was actually a big reaction against that, and he didn't get his way. And so when you hear, when people who own guns hear about liberals or gun control people saying they want to restrict guns, that's what they hear. They don't hear somebody who's saying, I just think that this will help people I think this will stop school shootings, or I think that this might do something to lower overall homicide rates, or whatever. They see that as you're trying to take away a check to the tyranny of the government. So that's a very serious thing, and they're going to take that very seriously, right? Just like you would take very seriously if the president got rid of the legislature, or got rid of impeachment, or tried to pack the court. Assuming you would do that, maybe you wouldn't feel that way if it was a Democrat doing that. I don't know. You've described yourself as a moderate Democrat, but so I'm not going to put words in your mouth on where you stand on that. But so here's the other thing on this idea of defense against tyranny. There's two things. There's two broad category disagreements that I think that a libertarian, and to some degree even conservatives, although they're much less intellectually consistent about it than libertarians are, have with the left. And that is two. One is that the idea that government is good at doing things, right? So I think a lot of progressives, a lot of liberals look at the state and they just see a panacea, right? They see something that any problem that they can think of, not only is the state a possible solution, it's the best solution, right? Some policy will fix whatever the problem is, whether we're talking about welfare, education, defense, environmental protection, the arts, whatever it is, whatever. And I totally understand that the state's a powerful thing. The state controls the education of most people directly or indirectly. And there's all this aura of authority that's associated with the state. There's all this, the monuments and all the ceremonies and the flags and all this history. And there's a lot of intellectual work that's done by people who make their living from the government directly or indirectly, saying how great it is, how much we need it. And I totally understand that. And that was exactly my mindset for, the first part of my life. If you had proposed any problem to me whatsoever, I would have said, yeah, the government should do something. Now, what exactly the government should do, I might not be able to say, but there should definitely be a law, right? There should be a law to fix that thing. And one thing that I think that you need to understand about libertarians and conservatives to a less consistent extent, at least some of them. Conservatives are all kind of all over the place on this. Some of them are really bad on this topic. Some of them are pretty good, depending on which one you're talking about. But the idea is the state is either not a solution at all for some problems, or if it is a solution, it's the worst solution, or not the, or at least certainly not the most ideal, right? And so this is actually what made me a libertarian. I wasn't raised a libertarian. I didn't happen before I had YouTube. It was happened before YouTube existed. It was gradually looking at topic by topic, right? You would get into these debates that I always thought were interesting debates about things like gun control or healthcare or education or the roads or whatever else. And I didn't come into that thinking the government's evil, we need to stop the government. You know, I didn't come into it from some of the simpler hardline libertarian, you know, it violates the non-aggression principle or anything like that. Not to disparage those arguments too much, but just to say that's not the place I was coming from. I was looking at it purely pragmatically in a utilitarian sense. And I think that when you fully account for the costs that the government imposes, and I don't just mean taxes and the violence that they impart coercively, at least on the margins, but on the opportunity costs, the things that don't happen because the government's there, the distortions that happen because the government's there. So a good example here would be like healthcare. A lot of people just have this knee-jerk reaction that, well, healthcare is too expensive and therefore the government should run it, and they somehow imagine it as a right. I would question the idea that it's a right, but I'd also say that if you analyze healthcare and you see why it's expensive, and this is actually some of my more popular early videos, I have a couple of videos from 9-10 years ago, I think I did a trilogy, why healthcare is expensive. That is an annotated, very partial list of the reasons why healthcare is expensive. And put it frankly, the government has made it extremely expensive. Some of those interventions, that was the point, right? When you have licensure of doctors, that was advocated by doctors for doctors to raise their rates. They wanted to charge more money. Now, of course, they say they do that because they want to protect consumers, but there wasn't an outcry of consumers demanding higher prices for medical care. Those were doctors who thought there were too many doctors. You know, I made those videos. I didn't even know about the Flexner report, which was a report circulated, which basically had that we should reduce the number of medical schools and reduce the number of doctors so the doctors that do exist can charge more. That's just one thing, but it goes all on and on and on down the line. So, you know, just looking at that one topic, it's very debatable to say, well, we just need the government to fix the problem, or the government is the solution. The government in that case, and I would argue this strenuously if we ever go there, is the problem. It's the reason it's so expensive. It's the reason our options are so few. The whole reason that we shifted to insurance, ironically enough, is actually because of FDR. There was policies during World War II setting maximum wages where you couldn't pay an employee more, but they didn't tax your income if it was allocated to perks like third-party medical insurance. And so that's how they competed for wages, right? And so the whole idea that that would happen was because of the government. So now we're 50 years later and people think, oh, it's just the market's out of control. The medical market's one of the most highly regulated, controlled markets out there. So that's just one example. But we could do all the same with whether they're talking about education, heavy industry, the roads, even environmental protection, right? So case by case by case by case by case. And I think that you need to understand that conservatives and libertarians look at it and they say, okay, the government's not necessarily, it's either not the best solution or it's not even a solution at all. And so if you're coming at it from that perspective, you have to understand that the idea that, well, we should just ban guns and then the government can protect you. The government has no obligation to protect you. It said so itself repeatedly, and it doesn't really have the ability to do so in any practical sense. I mean, we've been inundated. What percentage of television shows and movies feature policemen or cops or law enforcement in one degree or another, either as the direct protagonists or at least allies of the protagonists actively intervening to stop crimes, to defend people? It's some huge percentage of the stuff out there. I don't know if there's a conspiracy behind that. I'm not saying that there is. It could just be a popular way that it's done. But this is so misleading from reality as to be completely fictionalized. They're not going to intercede in a crime. They're going to, at best, they're going to investigate a crime, and they're probably not going to find the people who did it unless they get a lucky break. They're not going to stop a crime. And they're not going to deter that many crimes. They probably do deter some, but they don't deter that many. And so the idea that, well, we should just surrender that, the solution to self-defense problems is to just surrender that function to government, is something that conservatives and libertarians are just it's going to be a non-starter completely. And so when you look at, like, this is just maybe a tiny little policy thing, what they hear is you're mandating that I become a victim, you're mandating that I can't control. And this is something, I mean, just viscerally, I mean, I've even talked to people from other countries. Like, you have a good friend from the UK who just thought it was madness to him, the idea that he doesn't have the right to defend his life. It's his life. All other morality of the world kind of is built off of that simple fact that it's his life and he wants to live. And when the government comes and says you're not allowed to have a gun, or there's set conditions on you having guns, waiting lists, magazines, whatever, age restrictions, doesn't matter, that they're in effect, practically speaking, telling you that your life is not in your hands, that it's not your right to defend yourself. And that is something that is just at a basic level. I mean, it is as basic as you should not kill someone who's a fetus, right? Again, whether you agree with that or not, it's at least at that level, because you're talking about life and death for somebody. Now, those issues are not exactly the same, and like I said earlier, I'm not necessarily agreeing with you clustering them together, but to say that it's not serious, it definitely is. But here's the other problem. We can debate every utilitarian thing about every policy, whether we're talking about roads or education, whatever it is, and we can agree to disagree. But here's the thing that I really think where we separate the wheat from the chaff here. Even if you want to say that the government is a good answer for some of these questions, and like the public choice theory people and some of the economics people out there, they have more sophisticated arguments, along the lines of the so-called public goods, things that it's very hard to exclude. Everyone gets the benefit. It's hard to exclude people from benefiting. This would be like the military, for instance. It protects everybody, and it's very hard to prevent freeloaders, that sort of thing. Granted, the state that meets those criteria is a much more limited state than we currently have. It would be a minarchist state as far as definitions go. And there's a huge problem where people will justify a state with one argument, and then the state that they create goes far, far beyond that. So kind of an example here would be, if we talk about education, a lot of people will say stuff like, well, sure, private schools and homeschooling works if you have middle class or upper middle class or wealthy people. They can afford it, they have the time, they have the family structure to do it, but it doesn't work for the poor. Right? There's poor people, they're orphans, whatever, their parents are on drugs, single mom, working, whatever, and they can't afford it, or they don't have the wherewithal to educate their children. Therefore, we need public schools. That is an argument for providing, charity welfare schools for people who, for children who can't afford them. That's not an argument for compulsory schools that force everybody to go. Right? So there's this disconnect between the justification or the rationalization and then what we actually have, which is why I would actually characterize most of the justifications as rationalizations. Right? They're trying to find a way to justify what we have that the arguments they make don't really apply, or don't have the logical implications that they want to think. But beyond that, let's just say that, well, maybe the government is the answer to some solutions. The government also can be dangerous, right? The government can be tyrannical. The government can do horrible things, and there's a spectrum here, and it can do things that are just mildly annoying. It can inconvenience people, and it can do genocide. And the United States government, I mean, I think liberals understand this, can do genocide. Okay, it genocided the Native Americans, more or less as policy, much of the time, not all the time. This is sometimes oversimplified, but there were certainly instances where it had that effect, and that was the intent. There are people who talked about that as the intent. And when the U.S. military waged war against Native Americans, which it didn't wage war on all Native Americans all the time, again, there is some nuance here, but it did so to destroy them, right? Destroy their food supply, did everything it can to destroy them. And the federal government actively supported slavery. I did a video of the impending crisis of the South. He talks about how all the ways to which the state governments and the federal government worked to defend and support slavery. The type of chattel slavery that we had in the United States needed to be subsidized quite heavily, actually, in certain respects, by the various governments, including the federal government. Okay, so whether it's the fugitive slave law or just having a military that was kind of there to stop slave insurrections, right? What was the last slave insurrection? It was the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry. How did that end? Well, the federal government sent troops under the command of U.S. Army officer Robert A. Lee and crushed it, right? And that was the whole point of having, that was one of the main reasons to have a military at that point. And so, and never mind, say, the war in Vietnam, the fact that we have a government that's willing to drop atomic bombs, that's willing to destroy cities. I mean, we were killing people by the hundreds of thousands by the day in Japan, and almost that many in Germany some days, whether we're talking Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, wherever. Their potential bloodlust, and this is from, I mean, we're talking World War II, we're talking FDR, right? This is somebody who, I mean, people say it's far-fetched. People still venerate that guy like he's the greatest president ever. I mean, I just had a guy over like last weekend, and he was just saying, I just wish that we had FDR here. He would know what to do. And I was like, yeah, he'd round up all the Japanese and throw them in concentration camps. And that's like, I mean, he didn't deny that it happened. I've yet to have someone say that didn't happen, because it did. And that's not even necessarily the worst of the things that he did. So my point is that, and I heard this said once, conservatives are never going to give up their guns as long as there's any chance that the federal government can become tyrannical, or even more tyrannical than it currently is, right? We can have that debate too. I think that it's really blithe. I mean, I don't understand the mindset of liberals that they think that, I'm not sure. There's a couple different things they could say here. They say either that's impossible, like tyranny, and that's something that other governments can do, but for some reason the United States government can't do, which is really interesting too, because so much of the left is actually animated by the United States as an imperialist, evil, racist power. But then the federal government should not have any checks against it, right? The federal government should have plenary powers to do whatever. There's quite a disconnect there, I would say. If you think that it's this panacea, and that's the problem, is they think that it is a panacea and they don't want to give up their panacea. They think every solution every problem that they can imagine, they see the government as the solution, if not the best solution, maybe even the only solution. And so the costs that come with the government, the risks that, the taxes, the opportunity costs, the restrictions of personal autonomy through the regulations, and then even the probabilistic risks of a tyranny or some other degree of tyranny, not necessarily all the way, right? Not everything has to be Hitler to be bad. We don't have to go all that far. I mean, again, I wouldn't say FDR was a Hitler, but he was really, really bad. He was really, really, really bad. Just like I wouldn't say Hitler's a Stalin. Stalin's worse than Hitler. That doesn't mean Hitler was okay. Like, the Germans were faced with a horrible thing where, like, there were communists trying to take over, and so they went with Hitler. That was a mistake. They shouldn't have gone with Hitler. They shouldn't have gone with the communists either. They were both really bad, and to say that one was worse is not a justification for the other. But not to belabor the point too much, but I don't really understand this idea. So they come up with, I think a lot of them just believe it can't happen, that because if there's democracy, if there's voting, that somehow tyranny is restrained by that in some meaningful sense. I think that that's wrong. I don't think that there's much evidence to believe that, and it's also very ironic from people who think of Trump as a tyrant or an authoritarian or literally Hitler. Not every liberal thinks that. Not everyone's saying that. I'm not saying that you, Peter, are alleging that. But if you are, if you know people who are, you have to ask yourself, if that's how they feel, if they believe that, then why would you want them to have a monopoly on violence? Why would you want them to have a monopoly on force? It doesn't make sense. If you have somebody who is violent or not trustworthy or dangerous, saying that they should be the only one with weapons is crazy. That's crazy. So, and the other thing that I think we'll sometimes say is, well, maybe tyranny is possible. It's something that can happen, but having a gun and resisting is just futile, so you shouldn't try. That's a technical argument. I think that they are being very simplistic when they say that, and I would also say, even if it was true, I would say I would like to have the option of going down with a fight rather than just being led to the slaughter or just being a slave. I think that even if a slave revolt is impossible, so you could say this about, and this is maybe too close to home with our current political, zeitgeist at the moment, but like, would you have really told Nat Turner, hey, your slave rebellion is doomed to fail, so don't do it? You can't begrudge somebody, not to compare, not to say that people today are living in the same way that Nat Turner was, but they could hypothetically. And just to say, well, because it's futile, you shouldn't be allowed, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Right? I don't see that that's ethically mandated. And I also think that it's not correct. I think that if enough people rebel, then the chances of it succeeding could go from improbable or impossible to possible to likely to almost a foregone conclusion, right? If 2/3 of the country and 2/3 of the states and 2/3 of the people said, "No, we're not doing this," it's not clear how the other third. Are they going to nuke all their cities? And this is the big thing. They always like to say this. They make these. Well, you don't have enough armament to fight the government. Well, that is, if anything, an argument to legalize that armament for the populace. But the other thing is, warfare's not that simple. If it was, we'd have won Afghanistan very easily. Russia would have, the Soviet Union would have won in Afghanistan. We would have won in Vietnam. Right? The idea that just because the state can accumulate more capital in terms of destruction doesn't mean it's guaranteed to win, or that it's always going to be willing to fight. So, yeah, until this is like an exit. Like I said, this would be like Trump saying that, or some other Republican that you hate, or even a Democrat that saying, "I'm going to get rid of one of the checks. I'm going to get rid of the Supreme Court. I'm going to pack the Supreme Court. I'm going to get rid of the legislature. I'm going to get rid of impeachment, so that I can rule and have there be no checks in my power." Of course, people are not going to react positively to that, or they shouldn't. And conservatives and libertarians are going to feel that way about their guns. Now, there's a whole host of other things where I think a lot of liberals think owning guns imposes this enormous cost. And I think that that's very debatable. The idea that, there's a belief that it's just axiomatically obvious that if you have a gun culture and you allow people to own guns, it's going to cause all this crime. And the evidence for that is really actually quite weak. They don't even correlate. If you look around the world, there's lots of countries that have very, very restrictive laws, including almost all of the countries in Latin America, with one or two minor exceptions. They have very, very restrictive laws, more restrictive than any in Europe, and yet they have homicidal rates much worse than the United States. And if you look at the countries that people love to look at, like Australia or the UK, and say, well, look, they have restrictions and they don't have high crime, ergo restrictions, lower crime. No, those countries all had low crime predating. And there's other things you could say about how they count and whatever, but like the UK never had a mass homicide problem. They've only had 3 mass homicides in their entire history. One of them happened after their bans, 2 of them happened before, and over that time span, that literally means nothing. Statistically, it's completely meaningless. Same is basically true for Australia. It's not as stark as it is in the UK, but it's basically true. Homicide rates in Australia had been plummeting for 12 years before they enacted substantive gun control in the mid-90s. So again, there's not even a correlation there, but a lot of liberals just kind of assume that there is. They think it's so axiomatically obvious that they don't debate it. They kind of don't wrestle with the fact that in the United States, we've seen an explosion of the number of guns, but we've seen a decline in the number of homicides over the last 20 years. And so a conservative looks at it, and, conservatives, to the extent that they're animated about this issue, they're aware of all this, right? The NRA has done a good job, the GOA, the various conservative commentators out there that now, populate the world. They all know this. They talk about it. They put out the numbers. And so we know this. It's actually amazing, but how many liberals actually think that the homicide rate is higher now than it was 20 years ago? They think that it's going up, that we're in an epidemic of it getting worse and worse. And you can say that it's too high or it should be lower, fair. But the idea that it's getting worse, and the idea that guns are causing it to get worse, it's getting better, and guns are becoming more popular. They're more common than ever. So, like, the private stock of firearms is going up 4 or 5 million per year, even accounting for the ones that are destroyed, lost, whatever. There's this huge disconnect. It's like we do live in an opposite. When we talk about this about other topics, whether it's race or whatever else, where the communities are really siloed. I think that there's a lot of siloing that's happened, and so a lot of liberals are like, what's the big deal? I don't own a gun. I don't like guns. I don't see their value. So why do you care so much about it? Well, because some of them, it is part of their lives, but some of them, they are familiar with all these arguments. And there's another problem here, too, is that I don't know about the rank and file. Your average person who says they favor more gun control in some contrived poll that has wording that's very suggestive and leaning. Um, they have one opinion, but if you look at the rhetoric of the people who are really vehemently anti-gun, if you look at the Brady campaign, if you look at Alltown, if you look at Everytown, if you look at David Hogg, if you look at um, Carolyn McCarthy or Dianne Feinstein, or there's a peppering of legislatures who are really strongly anti-gun. They'll say things like they want to ban everything. Right? Dianne Feinstein said, "Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in tomorrow." She said she would favor that, even though she had a concealed carry license herself, and that makes her, like most people in government, extremely hypocritical. But and you hear people like David Hogg, and I use him as an example, but most of the Fab Four from Parkland would be the same, where guns are bad, guns kill, guns have no purpose, right? And okay, well, if the logic of that is not that we have background checks or that you are allowed one gun per month or something like that, the logic of that is that you just ban guns, right? If they say that they have no value, there's no reason to own them. And there's some kind of mixed messaging here, especially when you come to like assault weapons, so-called, where they say stuff like, on the one hand, they're battlefield weapons, they don't belong in civilian hands, they're too powerful, we need to ban them because they're too powerful. But then on the other hand, say, there's no way you could possibly resist tyranny with them. Well, I thought you just said they belong on a battlefield and they're too powerful. But now they're saying that they're completely useless, right? They'd have no effect, as if the Warsaw Ghetto armed with AR-15s and the Warsaw Ghetto armed with nothing is the same outcome. Those are not the same situations, okay? Even if the Wehrmacht eventually wins in both scenarios, they're not the same. And it's obvious they're not the same. The fact that liberals want to ban them so much and so adamant that they need to be restricted is evidence that they actually do think that they're important. My question is, why do liberals... This has been a losing issue for liberals for 20 or 30 years now, right? This really has been a losing issue for them. And so I would put the question back, why are they so adamant in doing this? And some of them have said, I mean, you can find videos of this online where they know that they can never get a straight up gun ban, so they go an incrementalist approach. They want to go, okay, so they ban things like 50 caliber rifles. 50 caliber rifles, yes, they're very powerful. They're never used in crime. They're just not practical for most people's criminal purposes, so they're never used in crime. Literally ever. There's no record of a 50 caliber being used in any crime. So why are they getting banned? Why is California ban them? Why does the Brady campaign want to ban them around the country? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And the same is true for these semi-automatic rifles, the so-called assault rifles. Right? These things account for something like less. I mean, I think all rifles together, and that includes the bolt-action rifles. I think that's something like 2 or 3% of all the gun homicides. So, like, they kill fewer people. I know this is true. They kill fewer people than hands and feet or clubs or knives. And yet, that's the thing we want to really go. Why? Well, because those aren't as popular. Not as many people own them. And so you go for that, and then you go for the other things. But, handguns kill 88, I think it's like 88% of all the homicides are done with handguns. And then shotguns are the number 2, and then rifles, and then semi-automatic rifles, so-called assault rifles, are a subcategory of that. And so there's a very deliberate incrementalist approach. And there's even people in the gun control movement who will admit that. And so gun rights people are very aware of this. And so they're very adamant. If every inch they take is just moving the ball forward to try and go even further, or there's no logical limit. And look, when even in your comment here, you're just saying, owning them at all is debatable. Okay, so I'm not going to have, how can we have a good faith discussion about magazine restrictions when I know that in your heart of hearts, again, it depends on how you phrase this question, but if not you, others are like this. If you think they can just be completely banned, then we're not having a discussion about magazine capacity. Because as soon as we have that discussion, then you're like, well, let's limit it to 10, and then let's limit it to 5, and let's limit it all semi-automatics. And then, you know what, you need to keep it in a safe at a gun club, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's why they're such as adamant. You can't give them an inch because they want to take a mile. And I want to turn this back. Why is this so important to some liberals? Right? Nobody gets elected on this. Nobody. There are people in really safe districts who can have this as a campaign thing, right? If you're in New York or San Francisco, you can have this as an issue. You didn't get elected for that reason, but you have the leeway to do it. It's a dead end everywhere else. The NRA is kind of famous for being one of the few lobby organizations that crosses political boundaries in a lot of ways. There's a lot of Democrats who want their endorsement and who do not want, I mean, even somebody like Bernie Sanders, for instance, right? He's left as they come, and he's not, I mean, he's certainly not an A plus in the NRA ratings, but just to give you an idea, so like they are that, it's one of the few issues that actually crosses the political boundaries in a way that, say, abortion doesn't or climate change doesn't. Climate change does it a little bit, I think, both ways. But so that's why it's an important issue. If you believe that government can be tyrannical, and I think that that's, I mean, historically that's a fact, and if you want to say the United States is somehow immune, I would say that that's incredibly naive and also relatively ignorant of history. And so, no, it's extremely alarming when somebody says, take away the safeguard, right? When someone says, you know, give me the keys, you know, it's fine, you can trust me. That's basically a red flag. You say, no, you can't trust me. And so, again, I don't know why. It's like an unforced error. This is just a losing issue for them. And so they really, I mean, nationally, they don't campaign on it really anymore. And nor should they. And yeah, so that is why. That is a good question, though. And thank you for it. I hope that helps. Let me see if I have comments here. Oh my gosh, we do. Hola. Who's shoddy? Let me get to comments here now for a little bit. What time is it? 3? Yeah, I got some time. Gun rights are an extension to self-preservation and the right to my right to life. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, you know, I would like to see more discussions on how anarchists can engage with culture more off the top, but there, oh, well, maybe one day. The left loves the idea of democracy until they disagree with them gets elected. Yeah, so I think this is true. There are certainly leftists who do really, I think, believe in democracy, and they look at it like, okay, well, we had an election and my ideas didn't win, and so, you know, I accept that, right? To kind of take the Al Gore line. I'm not sure. I don't think Al Gore is this principle. You know, I disagree, but I'm going to agree. I'm going to accept, you know, the declaration of whatever democracy. And there are people like that. But I think that for most people on the left, this is not true. I think most people on the left have an anointed vision, as Thomas Sowell would say. Right? They have a belief in how society ought to be, and they either see the government as the only way of implementing that vision or as part of that vision in and of itself, right? There's this means and ends kind of distinction that could be made. Do they want there just to be a big government, or they think they need the big government to bring about the world that they would need? Either way, and democracy is a way to rationalize that. So if they win the election, they can say, well, we have the mandate of the people, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if the democracy says no to whatever it is they're looking at, then there's, well, democracy is corrupted or it's wrong or whatever. So I think a lot of these people do have a vision of the world. This is what's so appealing about the state. The state can act as a chalice or a vessel for people to project their utopia onto. You know, so whatever your ideas are about whatever topics, it's very alluring to think, well, I just would love it if the government, quote unquote, did those, whatever it is. You know, maybe you think that public schools should emphasize poetry reading and athletics more, and you can just, I love the government because I hope that they'll do that one day. And they literally will project that the government actually will do that. And even when the government doesn't do those things or can't do those things for whatever reason, people will still support it on the hope or the implication that it will. So I did a video years ago called Government and the Chalice of Desire. Well, people just, what they want, they assume the government can or will do it, and then they support the government. They support the actual government based on a hypothetical government that just does their will, and it never does their will. Do you think you'll see lots of gun control being rolled out in the next few years? I'm worried the left might try and make some serious pushes in the future. I'm always worried that could happen. I'm always worried about that happening. You know, if you haven't been stocking up, I don't know what you've been waiting for. They will be resisted. Look, Obama got nothing done, and Obama was a very powerful president in many ways that Joe Biden is not even, he's not even a shadow of Obama, and neither is Kamala Harris, to be blunt. So I think that there's no reason to despair, but there's no reason not to be vigilant and to do what you can. If you have not been buying, selling, practicing, I don't know what you've been doing. If you legally have that option, you should have been doing it all along. I think an important factor in gun control requires in-depth understanding of our Constitution. How do you feel? I don't think that it requires that at all. I think that we can just kind of basic intuitions about rights and life and all that kind of imply gun ownership, and you don't have to know about the Second Amendment. You really don't. And I tend not to emphasize it that much. And I think it's pretty clear what it means. I think that the idea that it somehow allows gun control or is about the Army or the National Guard is just kind of stupid. And I think that that's, I mean, even the courts itself have ruled that way. But like, ultimately, the Constitution means whatever the government says it means, and so that's a weak read. I don't want to base my rights on the Constitution or the interpretation of the Constitution by a politically appointed judiciary, which is what we're always talking about. You know, why do people get so upset about Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying, or whenever they have a new justice? Because they know that you can affect how the laws are interpreted politically. With that, it's sad. I mean, it sucks that we don't really have law. People talk about we need a government so we can have clear laws, but we really don't, because the laws are based on the interpretive caprice of the state, right? So we don't really have law. When we can have a very elaborate contract where we go into all these details about everything, and that can be a beautiful thing. But then if it says, I decide, I interpret the contract, then it doesn't even matter what the contract says, because I can interpret away any clause or add clauses, whatever. And, you know, that's what we've had in the United States since the Marshall Court. You could argue, I guess, that the Constitution doesn't actually say that. The Constitution doesn't actually say judicial review, but it establishes a court, and that court granted itself, I mean, the very first court basically granted itself that prerogative, and it's just been accepted now to the zeitgeist. It has been for over 200 years. So, no, is the Constitution interesting and worth studying? Absolutely it is. Is a necessary cornerstone in defense of gun rights? No. People who don't live in the United States and don't have a Second Amendment have every right to own guns, right? The fact that the UK or Australia restricts people's rights to own guns is a horrible crime. It's absolutely horrible, and the fact that they don't have Second Amendments that make that legal doesn't matter to me. It's the optics. People are scared of them. ARs. Yes, they are. Never give them an inch. You can't give them an inch, they want a mile. It's very clear that they want a mile. Nobody who trumpets gun control is talking about some marginal, increases to background checks or slight magazine. They all talk about guns being evil and guns being bad and guns are only there for killing, and there's no reason to own a gun. And so, well, if that's all true, then they should just be bad. I've never found it necessary to have a gun for defense. Neither have I. I have them. I have that option, but you never know what's going to happen in the future. Yeah, gun control is ultimately about removing the possibility of opposition saying no to authority. Yep. I don't see how gun control would be effective in criminals because they're just going to steal one anyway. Yeah, I mean, gun control can affect criminals, but they don't affect criminals to the same extent that they affect law-abiding people. So let's say that we make it illegal to own guns, right? Radical position. There will be fewer guns and fewer criminals will have guns, for sure. But then law-abiding people will, by definition, follow the law. And all law-abiding people will then become unarmed. And so some criminals will become unarmed, but some criminals will ignore the law. And so now you'll have a situation where the disparity has grown, where the law-abiding population has become disarmed, and the criminal population has maybe been disarmed a little bit, but only some fraction. And so now you have a much worse situation. Even if there's fewer criminals, they now are armed and their victims are not. And the fact that they know that is going to make a radical change in their behavior. I wish I carry, but I'm also scared about liability. It's a serious responsibility. It is a serious responsibility, and autonomy comes with responsibility. Hey, JC, I'm doing good. With the conservatives now having the Supreme Court, do you expect a lot of gun control laws, assault weapons will gun permits to get struck down. I would love that to happen. I don't expect it to. The court has not been really good about curtailing, calling things unconstitutional. I don't know the specifics on all these justices. I think Alito, Thomas are probably okay. The other ones, I'm not so sure. So maybe stuff on the margins. Apparently, there's evidence that they're afraid to take cases from like New York. Like they want like places like New York City have really stringent laws, and they're avoiding like ruling on those cases. They don't want to rock the boat, and so they just ignore that those things even exist. If a gun control law is getting passed, I think we have to decide, are those laws really in the best interest of the people? Well, the problem there, Officer Webb, is the best interest of the people is, what would Hayek would say that's not sufficiently definite idea to have anything, to mean anything, right? You can do anything and say it's for the benefit of the people. It's very vague. It's like a nice idea, but it really, it's a concept through which you can put any policy, really. Joe Biden says he wants to stop aiding Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that Obama, his former boss, was a big supporter of Saudi Arabia. Do you think he's lying? Why or why not? I have no idea if he's lying. I have heard some things that Biden is less bellicose than Obama. On the other hand, Biden is high up on the people responsible for the Iraq War. He was the Senate chairman of the Foreign Service or Foreign whatever. So he was in a position to have stopped that war from even happening, and he didn't. And his non-fuck-up son died as a result. So maybe there was a lesson there for him. It's possible that there was. The whole reason that Obama was asked about this, and he said the reason we're supporting the war in Yemen is to placate Saudi Arabia. Why do we need to placate Saudi Arabia? Well, we need to placate Saudi Arabia because we gave Iraq to their enemy, Iran, right? Saudi Arabia and Iran have been in this Cold War / hot war for a couple decades now. And Saudi Arabia has a lot of Shiites in their country, and they're also, Wahhabis, so they hate Shiites for all those reasons, and vice versa. And Iraq was ruled by this Sunni dictator, relatively secular speaking as far as the Arab world goes, and brutal, as we all know, but Sunni nonetheless. And yet the majority of the people in Iraq were Shiites. Well, we got rid of Saddam, and now the Shiites, Shiistan is now extended to include Baghdad, which it hasn't for like 1,000 years or something like that. So obviously the Saudis were upset by that, and I guess I can't really blame them. And so helping them in their horrible war in Yemen, was just a way to quote unquote placate them. That's exactly the term that Obama used. I don't know how Biden felt about it. Apparently Biden was against the Libyan war, which again was basically done for Hillary Clinton's resume, so she could look tough. And I don't know. Kamala Harris has been talking tough on Syria, like regime change kind of stuff, code. So I wouldn't expect too much from Biden. If there was no constitution, owning a gun would be a privilege and not a right, which means it could disappear at any time. I know. I understand the Constitution is actually necessary. I don't know if I agree with that, because whether rights exist or not is probably independent of whether the Constitution says they exist. I think that's. I don't know any theory of rights that says rights come from the document, right? So, whatever the Constitution says or whatever the Supreme Court interprets it as saying doesn't really matter what rights are. To say that you want to ban or pass restrictions on guns means that people can't own what they want. Yeah, I mean, well, this is the conceit of liberals, right? They think that they know what's best for everybody. And it's okay to think that you know what's best and try and persuade people. Like if I really think, hey, you'd be better off if you did X, Y, and Z, and I try and persuade you, that's fine. But if I come and say, well, I'm passing a law, and if you violate the law, you're going to prison, and I'm going to force you to do those things, either that's completely always wrong, or at the very least that requires a very high burden of proof. That's a very high standard that you should have to reach to do that, and they just never do. They just kind of take it for granted. See if this is even on. If you did X, Y, and Z. Ooh, okay. I'm just checking to see how this looks on YouTube. Looks okay, good. Those countries don't actually have the right to own a gun. Yeah, Officer Webb. So is your opinion that before they wrote the Second Amendment, the right to own a gun didn't exist? Because I'd say the founders would actually not agree with that. Right? If you read the Constitution, it even says that they're codifying pre-existing rights. Is the way they looked at it. And we can debate that at a philosophical level, but that's the way they thought about it. So you're giving the Constitution more credit than it gives itself. It doesn't say that it's creating these rights. It says that it's establishing them. Right? That they're already there and they're codifying them. So no, if they amend, would you then, Officer Webb, would you say if they, Biden gets elected and whatever, he's able to amend the Constitution and basically get rid of the Second Amendment? Would you then say, well, I don't have a right to own a gun anymore because the Constitution doesn't say so? The Constitution, that line has been legally amended, and so we don't have the right to own guns because the Constitution's changed. Is that honestly your opinion? All right, I think that's kind of silly. And I think even liberals would almost understand that, right? Oh, you have a right to vote? Well, what if we change the law and says you don't have the right to vote anymore? Does that mean you don't? I think that they tend to think that everyone has the right to vote, even people who aren't citizens, right? Or dead people. So, one thing that really confuses me about Biden is the fact that he voted against the 91 Gulf War but supported the 2003 Gulf War. Do you have any idea why Biden opposed the 91? I don't have any idea why he did. I'd heard that too, and I don't know why. Um, the first Gulf War is really interesting, and I think I remember the first Gulf War, and I remember it being super popular. I remember thinking it was really cool, and I think that there's some evidence that the main reason it happened, because who really cared? Like, Saddam Hussein is somebody that we could play ball with. We subsidized him. We got along with him fine. Um, um, this Constitution is. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So after Vietnam, Americans were sick of war. And, in the mid to late 70s was kind of like a low point in the credibility of the government. People didn't trust it. And if you look, there are a lot of committees about the CIA, the Church Commission, a couple others, which I'll do videos on shortly, actually. And people really were cynical about the federal government, and they were cynical about war. And people in the government really hated that. And so there's actually a video of George Herbert Walker Bush saying that, the first Persian Gulf War was popular, and then we've, quote, whipped Vietnam War syndrome. Vietnam War syndrome was just this idea like, we're not patriotic, we don't want to go to fucking war, we're anti-war, blah, blah, blah. And Vietnam really did this. And so they wanted to have a war that would be popular. Who really cared? They didn't really care if Saddam Hussein ran Kuwait. He was still going to sell us the oil. It's not a big deal. And they kind of even gave mixed messages about it. And there were people, I think Warren Christopher was the Secretary of State at the time, has said he wouldn't have done it. He didn't think there was a big deal of whether he took Kuwait or not, and there was no need to go to the war. It was just something, it was a way to make war popular with Americans, and it worked. The Constitution is the supreme law of the country. I think it does matter. I think it does mean that, actually. Well, Officer Webb, that's kind of dumb. No offense, but like, if you're just going to say whatever the Constitution says, you're going to obey that completely, you realize that the Constitution is a political creature, right? A bunch of Democrats who hate liberty, hate rights, who hate the founding fathers, who think America is completely racist, they can scrounge together enough votes to edit the Constitution, and then you're just going to parrot that and say, well, that's what the law says? I guess your name is Officer Webb, so I shouldn't be too surprised by that. But come on. If there was no Constitution, the government wouldn't get in trouble and their power would be absolute. What do you mean? When does the government get in trouble, Officer Webb? The government doesn't get in trouble. The government is being asked to punish itself, and it never does. And, right, so, as a teen, I know more about guns than most people in my generation. The irony is that I don't even own one. Some people were actually frightened by my knowledge. How do you know so much about guns if you're just a teen and you don't own one? I mean, Officer Webb, you do know that the Constitution, it doesn't say that it's creating rights, right? It's saying that you have rights and it's just codifying them. So you're asserting the Constitution says stuff that it doesn't say. It doesn't say that it's creating rights. It says people create governments, or governments are created by people, but rights are not. Rights are given by people's creator. Right? That's what it says. George Bush was right. The Constitution is just a damn piece of paper. Yeah. They're currently violating the Second Amendment right now. I would say that they are. Right? And then the government's policing of itself, right? The lawyers that the government appoints to um, uh, adjudicate its disputes, aren't going to say that, and they haven't. Right? What is they didn't declare anything unconstitutional from like 1934 until 1995, as if there weren't thousands of unconstitutional laws passed in that time. The problem with this monopoly is that they get to interpret their own rules. So it doesn't matter what those rules are. Well, Lauren, you should definitely own a gun in real life as soon as you're old enough. Well, stating your rights doesn't mean it gave you your rights. That's different, right? Like if I write down on a piece of paper, Officer Webb, that you're alive, that doesn't mean that I gave you your life, or that your life, you know, or I say I acknowledge that you're alive, or I acknowledge you have a right to life, and then I go and I erase that, say, oh, you don't have a right to life now. Would you then be like, well, I guess I don't have a right to not a life now because Dave, sorry, length inner third, he scratched it out on that piece of paper. It is a piece of paper. Not everybody, like the Constitution, a couple people talked about, most people weren't involved in its creation. Most people weren't involved in its ratifications. AK-47 is cheap and reliable. Yes, sir. They're not so cheap anymore. Actually, if it wasn't on the piece of paper, the military could force them. So they can do that now. Right? Right? Have you ever seen the videos of them doing that Hurricane Katrina? I think that you have way too much faith in the Constitution. It's just a piece of paper. And if you read it and you look at what we actually have, there's a huge disconnect. What's poppin', Cozy? Yeah. Yeah. Officer Webb, how do you feel about the Branch Davidians, right? The military drove into their house and crushed them and killed them. Budget ARs, but ARs are stupid. Officer Webb. So you're going to say they didn't violate the Third Amendment by coordinating. They didn't sleep over. They just break down the door and took people's guns. There's video of them taking people's guns. There's video of them tackling old ladies and taking their guns. And that's not even talking about Waco, where they drive in with a Bradley fighting vehicle, right? Bradley fighting vehicle, and pump a place full of women and children with fucking CS gas, and then burn it down and kill everybody there almost. Yeah, I mean, there's people. You care about your rights, but you don't even think you have rights except if the Constitution says so, right? So if the Constitution says you don't have rights, then you don't think you will either. You think it all comes from that piece of paper, like it's some magic thing. And if it takes it away, then you won't have it either, right? If they were to get rid of the Second Amendment tomorrow, you would come on here and tell us, well, we don't have a right to own guns because the Constitution doesn't say that anymore, right? So come on. All right, guys, I'm getting distracted, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say. But I do want to thank Paragu for asking. Well, let me say his name right. I want to thank Peter Paragu for asking such a good question. Very interesting topic, worth always talking about. Gun control is how I got started on this channel. If you go back, all the first videos I made were on gun control. Fascinating, important topic, and so I didn't see any of that in the news. Officer Webb, not everything you need to see is in the news. The news edits the fuck out of things. You can go online right now on YouTube and watch videos of fucking uniformed officers beating the shit out of old ladies in Katrina and taking their guns, right, in their own home. They're in their own home, minding their own business, and they come and tackle them, take their gun, and then take them out of their homes. And you're going to say that's okay because they didn't spend the night. And you can watch video, watch the documentary Waco Rules of Engagement, or watch the HBO or the Netflix series on it, or read the book The Davidian Massacre. Those are your words and assertions of my opinion. That's what you said. That's what you said you believe, Officer Webb. So, all right, guys.